Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Glickman. I'm the president and CEO of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We want to welcome our live stream viewers. So we are both here in person, and we have viewers joining us on Facebook Live and a number of other channels from around the world. So we're quite excited. As a reminder, please silence your cell phones. 20 years ago, the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, was dedicated by survivors. Since then, we have welcomed more than 2 million visitors through the doors here in our Battery Park City home, and we've emerged as the primary resource in the New York tri-state area for teaching and learning about the Holocaust. We've taken our place as the third largest Holocaust museum in the world. Survivors remain the core and driving force of our community. As a living memorial, one of our sacred mandates is to magnify their voices and to preserve their testimonies. When a survivor tells her story, she reasserts the very humanity and dignity that the Nazis attempted to destroy. We offer as many opportunities as possible for survivors to speak to school groups and members of the public. I mention all of this because tonight's event is taking place during our Holocaust commemoration programs and events, which will run through the end of April. Young people of all backgrounds enter our doors to learn about the Holocaust and to remember. We continue to work to defy the Nazis' attempts to dehumanize and destroy the Jewish people. We remember the history of the Holocaust as a history of individuals. And this, in itself, is an act of resistance. Seems like a perfect segue into introducing tonight's speaker. Timothy Snyder is one of the leading American historians and public intellectuals of our time. He is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. His publications include The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America, the subject of tonight's lecture, On Tyranny, Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning, and Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. His works have received the Emerson Prize in Humanities, a literature award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Hannah Arendt Prize, and the Leipzig Book Prize for European Understanding. He is the 2017 recipient of the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, has received state orders from Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland. He is a member of the Committee of Conscience of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, serves as the faculty advisor to the Fortunoff Collection of Holocaust Testimonies at Yale, and continues to be a good friend of this institution. We have had the fortunate privilege of hosting a number of Tim's book launches here in Safra Hall at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, Tim Snyder.
Thank you, Michael, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for setting a tone which I would like to continue. It seems to me that in the United States of America, the Holocaust serves at least a double purpose. On the one side, as Michael was stressing, it's an event which we must remember in and of itself, in all of its specificity, in all of its detail. On the other side, the Holocaust is for us a connection to the history of the 20th century. And in my work, I've tried to stress both aspects of this, that we must remember the Holocaust as a crime of individuals, perpetrators, victims, bystanders, but also understand the Holocaust, because understanding the most important events of the 20th century can give us some kind of purchase on the 21st. One of the weaknesses, I think, of American public life, American intellectual life, political life, and moral life in the 21st century has been that we've chosen to let history go. The Holocaust is one way of trying to bring history back, directly or indirectly. It was not so very long ago that I was very often criticized for the claim that the Holocaust has some relevance to our own experience and to our own history, that the history of the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s might be in some way relevant to our own time. Sadly, that view is now approaching conventional wisdom. What I'd like to do in this talk, and really as I describe the next book, is to do for our time a bit what wasn't done in the 1930s. That is, the 1930s, although of course in many ways much more dramatic and much more catastrophic than our own time, the 1930s shared a feature with the 2010s, and that is a sense of the uncanny, the sense that things are happening which haven't happened before. Things are happening which we hadn't predicted. Things are happening which our own view of how life works somehow can't handle. Things are happening which shake us. Things are happening which are disturbing, but which are also just strange, deeply strange, and frequently strange, so that the strangeness of it all can become the main feature of the situation, and then in turn we can lose our bearings, and we can find it difficult to know what to do. And of course, in a minor key, right? In a minor key, that's something that we have in common with people who lived through the 1930s. This uncertainty as to what we should do and when we should do it, how to evaluate a situation which seems unprecedented. That's something that we share. So what I've tried to do in this book is something a bit unusual, which is to write a history of the present time. The Road to Unfreedom is a history of the 2010s, which essentially, it doesn't conclude, it lands, rather, in the middle of the Trump administration. It starts with Putin coming to power as president for a second time in 2012. It doesn't end. The conclusion considers the kinds of politics that we found our way into. And the central theme is precisely about what history is, or what restoring time would be. What I'm trying to do with this book, which is a kind of special effort, is to try to regain historical time, to give us history back, not just in the sense of knowing the past, which frankly would also be very welcome, but other books are about that, but rather in the sense of helping us to see ourselves in history. Because once you see yourself in history, then you have a sense of what's possible and impossible. If you have a sense of the structure, then you also can have a sense of agency, of what you can actually do. And so the book actually begins with a consideration of time, because I think it has to, and here's why. I think as we've let history go, it hasn't just been a matter of letting the facts go, letting the details go. It's been a matter of accepting a certain story, a story of progress, a story that I call in the book the politics of inevitability. The idea that we know the rules of how society works, that so long as we have X, let's say capitalism, we'll have Y, let's say democracy, right? Or if you're on the left, you know that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Not true, not true. There's no arc, and it doesn't bend towards justice. Neither of those things are true. Both of those are comforting stories, which I call the politics of inevitability. When after the end of communism in 1989, we decided that our story about the present was and the future was true. Then the problem with this, there are many problems with the politics of inevitability, but one problem is then you get a shock. For many Americans, that shock was the financial crisis of 2008. For perhaps many Americans in this room, it was the election of Mr. Trump in 2016. The problem with the politics of inevitability is that if you imagine that everything is going in a certain direction, when something happens that you can't expect, you're shocked, you're disoriented, you're vulnerable, you don't know what to do. And then what creeps in from the side is the alternative to the politics of inevitability, what I call the politics of eternity. Rather than progress, doom. Rather than certain optimism, certain pessimism. The idea that the only thing that ever happens is those other people are coming for us, the good ones. That the only thing which ever happened in history was threat. And by the way, whether you oppose Mr. Trump or whether you support Mr. Trump, this mood might apply to you. In the politics of eternity, the future goes away. All that we have is the sense that the same thing is happening over and over and over again. And of course, this is a description of the United States of America that we're living in now. How many of you don't have to raise your hands, but how many of you actually believe that the federal government is capable of formulating policy for the future? How many of us are actually trapped in a cycle, whether it's outrage or indignation, where the daily news is what determines our mood? How many of us have noticed that a big part of the country now thinks in terms of America first, or making America great again, loops back into the past, which of course obviate any ability to think about a sensible future together. The reason why I dwell on time like this is that this is what the road to unfreedom is. In the road to unfreedom, people who have hope give way to despair. People who are sure about progress give way to doom. And the only way to catch that, to stop it in the middle, is to see the history for what it actually is. And so this book is meant to be a history of the present. Now, one of the things which the politics of eternity taught us is that there are no alternatives, which is a very, very convenient, unbelievably lazy thing to think. If there are no alternatives, of course, it doesn't really matter what you or I do. Civic action doesn't matter very much. Things are always going to sort themselves out the way they are. And again, there are no alternatives can appeal to people who are on the right or on the left. On the right, you can say, well, of course, the market's a good thing. It always brings about democracy. On the left, you can say, it's neoliberalism. What can we do about it? It's an unstoppable force, right? But either way, we seem to be trapped by the idea that there are no alternatives. The way I start the book in chapter 1 is to show that, of course, there were alternatives. There are alternatives. There will always be alternatives. And some of these alternatives emerged before our eyes without our even paying attention. So, for example, to begin in Russia, where the book begins. And the book begins in Russia, by the way, because everything now begins in Russia, right? You might have noticed that the way to tell what's going to happen tomorrow in America is to read Russian newspapers from 10 or 12 years ago, right? It is actually much more effective than following our own news cycle. Even the language, I mean, every new American phrase, whether it's fake news, for example, those are things which Russians were saying 10 years ago. The book begins with ideas, and it begins with Russia because I need to insist that ideas do matter. The reason we don't think they matter is that we're trapped in one. If we're trapped in the idea of the politics of inevitability, that's an idea that says ideas don't matter. And whenever anyone comes up against us with something that's an idea, we say, how interesting. But at his core, he's really a pragmatist. He really just cares about his own material interests. And therefore, goes the assumption, everything will turn out well. Because so long as we all care about our own material interests, everything will somehow sort itself out in the great market of the world. So if, for example, the president of the Russian Federation begins to regularly cite a major fascist philosopher, if the president of the Russian Federation exhumes the body of this major Russian philosopher and brings it back to Russia, if the president of the Russian Federation finds the papers of this great fascist philosopher at Michigan State and brings them back to Russia, if the president of the Russian Federation talks about this fascist philosopher in 2011 and 2012 when he plans his new mission for Europe, when the president of the Russian Federation cites this fascist philosopher when he justifies his invasion of Ukraine, his campaign against the West in general, do we notice? No, we don't notice. And if we do notice, we say, well, deep down he's just a pragmatist, and really, this is all just window dressing for his bait. No. Ideas do matter. When the politics of inevitability shifts to the politics of eternity, ideas matter. This particular Russian philosopher, whose name was Ivan Ilyin, with whom I begin the book, is someone whose return heralds this shift from progress to doom. It's worth taking these ideas seriously because this return to the 1920s and 1930s is happening all over the place. Like so many things, first in Russia, but also in Poland, also in Hungary, also in Britain and France, and in our own way in the United States of America. We're returning the thinkers and ideas of the 1930s. What does this philosopher say? He has a very interesting and useful view on life. He's not useful to any of you, but useful if you are the head of an oligarchical clan in Russia. The view of life is God's creation was a failure. Nothing in the world around us is meaningful or true. There's no factual reality. The only good thing is a restoration of the totality of the world, which will be brought about by which country? Russia. Which will be brought about uniquely by Russia. In the meantime, Russia is inherently innocent because Russia is the font of God's innocence and goodness, and the rest of the world is decadent and corrupt. And the only thing that happens in history, therefore, is a cycle of uncomprehending foreigners attacking Russia over and over and over again. And if you listen to the way Russian diplomats talk about the world now, you'll realize that it is purely this. No matter what Russia actually does, whether it's interfere in the US elections or invade Ukraine, whatever it might be, it turns out that actually it means that Russia is being attacked over and over and over again. Now, this view, which was fascist in its origins, this man Ilyin was a thinker of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, this view which is fascist in its origins is very convenient if you happen to be at the head of a kleptocratic regime. Why? Well, for one thing, Ilyin as a fascist says that the Russian nation is like a body, everyone has their own role, individuals are like cells or like embryos, democracy is therefore a meaningless ritual, that's how he describes it. It doesn't make sense to count votes. Those are all very convenient ideas. Another convenient idea is, let's say that politics is entirely about the foreign enemy coming to Russia. That then becomes a justification for not having any domestic policy at all, but instead governing the country through regular attacks on chosen enemies, be it Ukraine, be it the European Union, be it the United States of America. And these ideas are also very convenient if you're an oligarch like Mr. Putin, who has discredited democracy as a succession principle. This is the key and the essential problem of Russian political life. No one knows what will happen when Mr. Putin dies, and no one is allowed to ask the question out loud. No one knows. And therefore, what you do with the politics of eternity, like Mr. Putin does very skillfully, is you refer back to the past, you create daily spectacle, so the question of what happens next never actually arises, And this is where things get interesting if you're beyond Russia, what you must do is you must create spectacles abroad which distract your own population and which somehow confirm the impression that you are the victim the entire time. And the first target of all this was the European Union. I promise I will talk about Donald Trump before this is over. I will talk about America before this is over. But there are really good reasons to put Europe in the middle of the story. For one thing, Europe is the biggest economy in the history of the world, right? As they don't teach us in American schools. The European Union is a bigger economy than ours. It's a bigger economy than China's. It's the biggest economy in the history of the world, as no one ever notices. It is also the largest and most important zone of contiguous democracies in the world. It is also a direct neighbor of the Russian Federation. When Russia begins this turn in 2012, 2013, the turn is not directed first against us. It's directed first against the European Union. What Mr. Putin does is he defines this politics of eternity. He transforms these fascist ideas into a foreign policy which he calls Eurasia. Eurasia is very interesting. What Eurasia says is, we don't need European integration the way the Europeans have it, based on those boring laws and those dreadful bureaucrats and based on things like freedom and prosperity, which who needs those things? What we need instead is an integration which is based upon values, civilization, as Mr. Putin says. It's unclear what those values actually are. It seems to involve heterosexuality, as far as I can make out. But the basic, which is for me kind of a fuzzy, it's fuzzy as a virtue. But the idea is we will organize integration, or rather we'll redefine integration as a kind of dictators club, where you don't have to do all those tiresome things that the European Union wants you to do, like have elections, like have the rule of law, like have a functional market economy. We'll have a dictators club which starts with Russia, have Kazakhstan, Belarus, and it will have Ukraine. And it's Ukraine where things start to get interesting, as we're going to see. But we have to pause on Europe and speak about Europe, because it's in Europe where we can see a preview of how the politics of inevitability, the certainty that everything goes your way, breaks and starts to give way to the politics of eternity. The Europeans have their own politics of inevitability, which goes like this. We, European nation states, have long histories. In our long history as European nation states, we learned things. And the main thing that we learned was that the Second World War was a bad thing. And from that lesson, we drew up this project of European integration. And we're smart because, unlike Americans, we learned that war was bad. Okay? So that basic recitation is something that you've probably heard from your European friends if you happen to have European friends. The interesting thing about it historically is that it's 100% wrong. There's absolutely nothing correct in any of that. The Europeans never had nation states, unless you're Finnish, in which case I apologize. They had empires, and those empires broke apart in a series of bloody anti-colonial wars around the time of the Second World War. And the fragments that were left over from empire then joined in this economic project which becomes the European Union. There's never a moment when the major European states were actually nation states. So they weren't nation states. That part's fundamentally wrong. Second, they didn't learn from the Second World War. Right? Also not true. If Europeans had learned from the Second World War that war was a bad thing, then the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Poles and the Belarusians and the Jews would be the most pacific people in the world, because they're the ones who suffered most from the Second World War. And we can happily debate like whether the Jews or the Belarusians or the Ukrainians or the Russians are the nicest, whatever you like. You know, I'm happy to concede that the Jews are the nicest. But you see, that was populism. Don't let it work on you. Okay. But the point is that there was no direct learning of this kind. What people actually learn from is losing colonial wars. Germany lost a colonial war in Europe. And then the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the British and the French lost colonial wars elsewhere. And it was the losing colonial wars which allowed Europeans to form the European Union. And then once they formed the European Union, they say, we were always nation states and we were always nice and we learned from war that war was bad and so on, which allows them not to talk about their bloody colonial history. Okay? That's the European politics of inevitability. Why is that so important? Because it creates the vulnerability for the politics of eternity. Because then someone comes around and says, well, since you were always nice, innocent nation states, why not go back to the 1930s when you were such good nation states? Things were really good back then in the 1930s when you were a nation state. And of course, that's the argument for Brexit, which is historically ludicrous. That's the language that the Front National speaks in France. It's also the language of Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, right? And here's the point. It's the message which Russia pushes on Europe. In Russia's support of the extreme right, in Russia's funding of the Front National in France, in Russia's cyber intervention on behalf of Brexit, the message is always the same. Go back to when things were good, to when you were a nation state. In other words, because all Europeans believe a fairy tale about their own history, they all believe a version of the politics, not all, okay? I know there are some that don't. I know. You're going to like raise your hand and say, I never believed any of that. Okay, I'm ready for it. But because most Europeans believe in a fairy tale about their own history, they're vulnerable to people who abuse that fairy tale, whether it's populists at home or Russians abroad. So what Eurasia does is it comes in and says, you don't need all these rules. You're naturally good on your own. Go back to being a nation state. There's a philosophy to this. The test of this, which, I mean, if I was going to make a long story even shorter, everybody fails. The test of this is Ukraine. The test of the politics of eternity is Ukraine. What is happening in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014 is that a number of young Ukrainians and others believe very sensibly that the purpose of the European Union is to give them the rule of law. A number of young Ukrainians very sensibly protest against a president who first said he would sign an association agreement with the European Union and then changed his mind, right? And that sets off protests which are organized at first mainly by young people who precisely want to have the kind of European life which other Europeans have and which they had taken for granted for themselves. Now, the reason why all of this becomes extremely interesting, so why is that interesting? That's interesting because it's a politics of the present and the immediate future, right? It's neither a politics of inevitability nor a politics of eternity. It's a politics of how things might be better a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. But it gets clobbered in Europe and in the United States by the Russian politics of eternity. What the Russians come in and say is, no, this is not about the rule of law. This is not about Europe. This is about much more interesting things. It's about the deep historical past. It's about how someone may have been baptized in Russia not in Russia, Russia didn't exist, I've just given way to it myself. Someone may have been baptized 1,000 years ago in what was going to become a Kievan state, and therefore Russia and Ukraine are the same place. Or Catherine the Great conquered some of what's now Ukraine, therefore Russia in the same, or Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, therefore Russia and Ukraine are the same place. In other words, that's the politics of eternity at work, looping back to the past, right? Or to bring it closer to home, when Russia argues that the Ukrainian question is a matter of culture or language or Russian speakers, that's the politics of eternity. Rather than thinking what are people's interests or preferences as they themselves express them, we accept a language of permanence, of eternity. They always spoke Russian, therefore they're always going to be Russian, right? We accepted that to a startling degree. If we look back at our own news coverage in 2014, we find it full of maps where people are colored according to their supposed language or ethnicity, right? Where part of the map is one color and part of the map is another color. That's what the politics of eternity looks like in practice. When you are convinced that for deep historical reasons, the people inside a country are divided into two warring groups because of ethnicity or language, that's what the politics of eternity feels like. And when you accept it in another country, you've taken one very big step towards accepting it in your own. That's at the level of principle. Now let me talk about the level of practice. In Ukraine, Mr. Putin and others did a number of things to which we didn't pay close enough attention because they were then going to repeat themselves in the United States a couple of years later. One of the most important is the appeal to susceptibility. So we all now know this, right? We all now know that this is how social media platforms work. That I know that you care about the Montreal Expos, and I know that you care about Evel Knievel, and I know that you're a stamp collector, and therefore I Facebook direct content at you according to these vulnerabilities, right? We know that that's how it works now. What Russia did in 2014 was use social media platforms and other means to direct political propaganda at people who would be vulnerable to it. So if you were on the left, you were told that Ukraine was a rising fascist regime. Meanwhile, if you were on the far right, you were told that Ukraine was a conspiracy of Jews. These people never heard that message, and these people never heard that message, but everybody got riled up. And the fact that it was contradictory didn't matter, right? The contradiction didn't matter, since the point was just to divide and confuse. I'm trying to make this sound like the 2016 presidential election. Am I succeeding? Because it's the same tactic they applied here. Another thing was the brute denial of obvious reality, right? Governing from that. Mr. Putin, although Russian forces invade Ukraine 3 distinct times, in February and August of 2014, then again in January 2015, he simply denies that a war is taking place. So that governing from a position where you simply say something obvious is not true, and then you fill the vacant space with complicated and interesting fictions, that is something else which starts in Russia, and then which comes here, right? Imagine having a head of state who denies the most obvious realities and then fills the public space with lots of sophisticated and interesting fictions. Wouldn't that be a weird country to live in, right? Mr. Putin pioneers that, and that comes here. The weird and sophisticated fictions that appeared in Ukraine were things like the claim that a Russian-speaking boy was crucified by the Ukrainian army, which was completely wrong, right? Did not happen. It was a fiction in a fiction in literally the same sense that Barack Obama is born in Africa is a fiction. A consistently and deliberately told lie, which is meant to occupy a certain amount of the physical space. And by the way, birtherism was also spread directly by Russian propaganda, in case you didn't know, beginning in 2010. Or another example, when MH17 is shot down, what happens? You respond to it by coming up with 5 or 6 mutually contradictory versions of what happens. What actually happens is not complicated. The Russian weapon shoots down a civilian airliner during a war when they invade another country. Simple. But you come up with a bunch of stories where, in fact, it was the Jews, or in fact, it was the Jews, or maybe it was the Jews. Oh, there's some other versions where, there was a Jewish Ukrainian oligarch called Ihor Kolomoisky who they actually blamed for this in one of their versions. In another version, it was an accident. In another version, it was Ukrainian fighter jets. But what you do is you fill up the media space with a whole bunch of stories, so at the end of the day, people are just not sure. That, again, is used in the United States in 2016. Who really believes that Hillary Clinton is a pedophile, and who really believes that John Podesta consumes bodily fluids at weird satanic rituals? Given the way tastes are in New York, maybe some of you do believe this stuff. But the point is that you fill up the public sphere with these stories, right? And at the end of the day, everything is confused and nobody knows. We didn't catch this in Ukraine in time. And this turns out to be a shame for us. It's not just a mental failure. It is because it is all one campaign. When we looked at Ukraine from the point of view of a Russian politics of eternity, and we said, oh, look, those Russian speakers are fighting those Ukrainian speakers. Oh, look, there's some clash of civilizations in a faraway country, of which we know nothing, right? When we did that, we were failing to see the stakes, which were us. The stakes were, can you have an international order based on law? Those were the stakes. And the Russians understood that, even if we didn't understand that. They were saying over and over and over again, our war with Ukraine is a war against the West. And they meant it literally. When Putin's advisor on Eurasia, Sergei Glazyev, says that in order to win the war in Ukraine, we have to exterminate the American elite, he's making a pretty direct connection. When the person in charge of security for Russian forces in Ukraine says that the thing that America and Ukraine have in common is that they are disintegrating states, these are words which perhaps we might have paid more attention to than we did. And it wasn't just rhetoric. As I chronicle in the book, and some of this has now come out also thanks to Mr. Mueller, the cyber campaign against the United States of America begins concurrently with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It begins at the same time, and the same things are done. They just work better on us because we weren't expecting them. They work better on us because we didn't see the connections. And these are not just the tools of media manipulation, which I talked about, these techniques, but they're also very simple things like malware in power plants. The same malware which was installed in Ukrainian power plants or the Ukrainian electricity grid is now installed in the American electricity grid. You know that, right? Right? Okay, you know it now. So, and it happened at the same time. This is all one story. In 2016, when we were shocked, right, suddenly all of this rushed to us all at once. But in fact, all of these things had begun much earlier. And the point of the book is to show all the connections. The point of the book is to tell this as a history so that it all makes sense, right? So that by the time I get to 2016, which is chapter 6, which I'm going to talk about now, and then we'll have some questions. By the time we get to 2016, things are interesting and perhaps distressing, but they're not surprising, right? Because the patterns of the history have already been established. So let me now talk about the United States for a moment. Among my friends and colleagues who talk about US and Russia and so on, there are basically two camps. There are people on the left who say, let's not talk about Russia because we don't know anything about it. Okay, that's not what they say. They say, let's not talk about Russia because if we talk about Russia, that will just disguise the fundamental problems in the US. And then there are some folks I know who are more interested in foreign policy who say, let's talk a lot about Russia because Russia poses a basic geopolitical threat to the US. The interesting thing about this is that those are not alternatives. Everybody is right. There is no way that we can understand the problems of the United States without asking why we were so vulnerable to Russia. And there's no way we can understand the tactics of the Russian Federation without understanding the vulnerabilities of the United States. This is a false distinction, which is leading us nowhere. So, of course it's true that Russia chose the President of the United States. Of course that's true. Mr. Trump doesn't exist publicly without Russia. Mr. Trump exists as what? As someone who plays a successful businessman on TV, which, by the way, is itself very interesting because I know a lot of successful businessmen, and with all due respect to those of you who are in the crowd, not a single one of you could play a successful businessman on TV. Because it's a completely different skill set, right? Mr. Trump has the skill set of someone who can play a successful businessman on TV, which is an unrelated skill set to actually being a successful businessman. It's unrelated, right? They have no relationship one to the other. It's two different sets of people. I mean, you wouldn't actually hire, the guy you wouldn't hire JR from Dallas to manage your retirement portfolio. You wouldn't, but you would elect him president of the United States, right? So we fell for this, and it's important to own it. But my point about Russia is this. Mr. Trump wouldn't have even been able to make a case for himself as such a TV character without Russia. Because when after Mr. Trump's 6 bankruptcies, after US banks stopped loaning to Mr. Trump, it is only the Russian investments in the 2000s and the 2010s which vaguely keep him afloat. Without Russia, Mr. Trump does not even exist as the fictional character who we elect president of the United States, right? And this is important because we can get into quarrels about how important was it in November 2016, and the answer is very. But before we even get there, we should know that he doesn't even exist without Russia. He certainly doesn't become the Republican nominee without Russia, which is why Republicans have just as much reason to be upset as Democrats. I mean, if you're John Kasich or if you're Marco Rubio or whomever, this person was chosen over you by a foreign power to be the Republican nominee, not just president of the US, but to be the Republican nominee. So certainly Mr. Trump would not be our president without the actions of the Russian Federation. And by the way, the Russians have not particularly hidden this. I mean, one of the ways this book is a bit different than other books about Trump and Russia and so on is that I start from Russia and I start from the Russian sources, and that gives that changes the flavor very dramatically, because of course when Russian diplomats speak to us in English, they deny the whole thing and they scatter various versions and so on. But when they're talking to themselves in Russian, they say very different things like, ha ha, we chose the American president and they slept through it, right? They say, they're not actually trying to hide this. And those of you who know Russian will know this as well as I do. They're not actually trying to disguise the fact that they interfered in the US elections. Only when they pro forma, they have to talk to us and hold out some kind of hope that they didn't do it. Okay, so without the Russians, he wouldn't have existed, he wouldn't have been nominated, he certainly wouldn't have won, right? I mean, his campaign the Democrats asked the whole time, where's the campaign? And that was a very good question, because the campaign was largely run by foreigners, the foreigners of Cambridge Analytica and the foreigners of the Russian Federation. The financing of the campaign, I'm sure we'll learn more. But it's interesting that between his nomination and his election, 70% of the purchases of Trump real estate were by shell companies, which will lead back exactly where do you think that is going to lead back? He certainly wouldn't have won without the hacking of the Democratic Party, which is a bigger deal than we think. It's a big deal when one political party and not the other gets hacked, because it means that everybody on the Democratic side was operating in completely different psychological conditions than the people on the Republican side were. If you were on the Democratic side, you knew that all of your donors were getting cell phone calls with death threats, right? If you're on the Republican side, it meant that, the Democratic side, it meant that your staffers during the convention were getting cell phone calls from people who were threatening bombs and so on and so forth. That changes the whole game psychologically. The Republicans didn't have to deal with that. And that's not even beginning to talk about how the email hacks were then used later on. So for example, Access Hollywood. Why wasn't everybody scandalized by Access Hollywood? Because 30 minutes after the Access Hollywood tape was released, 30 minutes, the Russians then dropped portions of John Podesta's emails, and then Russian bots and trolls helped to spread the story that these emails reveal how Hillary Clinton is a pedophile pimp and how John Podesta consumes bodily fluids at dinner parties. Which means that immediately the people who should have been scandalized by Access Hollywood are able to say, but your person, your woman is much worse. And that's what they said, by the way, right? That's what they said. That's what people thought. Well, maybe Trump did this, but your person did something which is much worse. The reason why Access Hollywood doesn't kill Trump is that he has Russia on his side. And again, that's not even mentioning the social media campaign, which was massive, right? We now know that Cambridge Analytica had the personal data of most of the American electorate. It is just a matter of time before you find out everyone to whom they sold it. We now know that the Russian Federation attempted to hack and successfully did hack the voter rolls of 7, that attempted more than 20, successfully hacked the voter rolls of 7 American states. That's useful data to have if you're carrying out a social media intervention. And of course, we know that Russia and other actors very successfully got to voters in crucial states like Michigan and Wisconsin in the weeks right before the election. We know all kinds of interesting things now, like for example, that the fake news stories on Facebook were more popular than the real news stories. I mean, if for those of you who were out actually campaigning, as I was in that fall, it was very striking what you were encountering. The fact that the 20 most popular fake news stories were more widely read than the 20 most important news stories in September and October of 2016 really made a difference for the kinds of conversations it was possible to have with real people. And I think it pretty clearly affected electoral behavior. And all of that is leaving aside the fact that from Papadopoulos through Page, through Flynn, through Kushner, through Trump Jr., through Trump himself, you have a remarkable set of personal connections with the Russian Federation. Manafort, one doesn't even need to mention, right, that Manafort was the main political advisor of the very Ukrainian president who turned away from Europe and caused a revolution, right? That same Paul Manafort. The Ukrainian story and the American story repeat themselves almost uncannily. When Manafort was finally arrested, people literally celebrated on the street in Ukraine. We in the United States are still asking ourselves, what does this exactly mean, this Manafort, right? In other parts of the world, it was very clear what it meant. So on the one hand, of course, no Russia, no Trump. On the other hand, the form that the Russian attack takes reveals our vulnerabilities very clearly. Russia is like a bad doctor, an evil doctor, right? The doctor who you go to and who diagnoses all of your problems correctly in order to make them worse. Now, knowing that doctor is useful because what is on his clipboard is very good information, right? His diagnosis of you is correct. His actions may be malevolent, but his diagnosis of you is correct and worth listening to. So the Russian diagnosis of the US goes to the heart of what I'm calling the politics of inevitability. We weren't concerned enough precisely about how our version of capitalism, our unregulated version of capitalism, created gray zones where actors from Russia could, for example, prop up and support a politician like Mr. Trump. If it weren't for the fact that you could have anonymous real estate purchases in Trump Tower in the 90s, Russia and the Russian mob and Trump might never have made friends. If it weren't for the fact that you can have anonymous companies in Delaware, it would have been much more difficult for Russian shell companies to purchase real estate in this city. By the way, driving up real estate prices here tremendously, right? Okay, good, second populist move and you resisted it, good job. All right, well done. Although that part is of course also true. If we were more attentive to the form that our capitalism took, we wouldn't allow our banks to do business with anonymous clients. With simple things like that, the connection between Russian oligarchy and an American aspiring oligarch would be much harder to make. That's our politics of inevitability, our sloppiness about our capitalism. Likewise, if we didn't believe that technology were automatically enlightening, if we hadn't fallen for all that nonsense about how like the more connected we are, the smarter we are, and so on, if we hadn't fallen for that, it would have been much, much harder for Russia to hack an election, right? But we fell for that. Most of us fell for it. Most of us believed it in some version. Even more specific things like our health system. If we didn't have the idea that the free market were an acceptable way to handle health care, we wouldn't have the opioid crisis, which was something which is happening in the US on a horrifying scale. I mean, one of the uncanny things about American life is that American life expectancy is going down. Year after year, 2 years in a row now, it's going to go down in 2017 as well. That is uncanny. That is very strange, right? And one of the main reasons it's going down is opioids. And we have opioids because we don't pay attention to how we run healthcare. We don't have a national healthcare system. Why is that relevant? Why am I talking about opioids, aside from the fact that while I gave this lecture, multiple people died of an overdose? Well, there's another reason, which is that Mr. Trump won the election in counties which are in opioid crisis. Every single county that Mr. Trump flipped in Pennsylvania is an opioid crisis. Every county in Ohio that Mr. Trump flipped, except for one, is an opioid crisis, right? That is how he won the election. He took traditional Republican voters, plus he took people in counties where people are killing themselves or dying of overdoses. So the fact that we let things go the way that we did helped Mr. Trump win, and all of these things are just examples of the larger problem of inequality. When you allow inequality to reach the kind of stratospheric proportions which we've allowed, when you become the only country that rivals Russia in wealth inequality, that's us, when you become that country, it's not surprising that Russian-style information warfare works, because the greater the income and wealth inequality there is, the harder it is for a society to talk to itself. If you're extremely wealthy, the truth is not enough for you. And if you're extremely poor, the truth is too much. You can only have a society that communicates with itself if you have some plausible version of equality. And we didn't, and we paid the price. Our other weaknesses, Russia also notices. Societal ones, like racism, they aimed for that. Lobbying ones, like guns, they aimed for that. Institutional ones, like the Electoral College, they aimed for that. They knew perfectly well that they had to concentrate on Michigan and Wisconsin at the end, and that's exactly what they did. So what we see at the end, what we see by the end of this, is a kind of dark globalization, right? In our politics of inevitability, we were normal, there were no alternatives, history was over. The only thing left to happen was that the rest of the world was going to become more like us. In fact, what happens in the history that I try to tell in this book is that we're becoming less of a democratic society all by ourselves, right? Citizens United in 2010, decision in 2013 by the Supreme Court, which allows 22 American states to institute voter suppression laws, galloping wealth inequality. We're becoming less democratic all by ourselves, and the world is becoming less democratic around us. For the last decade or so, that's been the general trend. But more than that, it's not that our normality projects outward virtuously into the world. It's that the world, or specifically hostile actors like Russia, can see the flaws in our system, not just as flaws to critique, but as vulnerabilities to attack, as attack surfaces, which is exactly what happened, which is why we are where we are. In other words, we were shifting from a politics of inevitability to a politics of eternity anyway. And a Russia, which was already in the politics of eternity, beckons us forward with its cyber, with its psychology, beckons us forward into a future where we are even more like them. This is a road, that's the road to unfreedom, that's the road from which we should get off. So what's the point of history then? The point of history is to try to stop us where we are, to see ourselves for where we are, to see our country in the world where it is, and to see the ideas as ideas. Because the idea of the politics of inevitability and the idea of the politics of eternity have many things secretly in common. And one of the things they have in common is the total absence of responsibility. If everything's going to go well no matter what you do, you have no personal responsibility. If everything's going to go badly, regardless of what you do, you also have no sense of personal responsibility. So it is, sadly, very convenient to go from being basically content to being shocked and not knowing what to do and being in despair. That's convenient, because in both modes, you're not personally responsible. What history does, or at least what I've endeavored to do in this little history book, is to show just what you can do. Because if you see history for what it is, if you see the structure for what it is, then you can also see the places where you can push in the structure. So in one way that this book is incredibly old-fashioned, aside from the fact that it has a huge number of sources in lots of languages, one way that this book is very old-fashioned is that I talk about virtue. I talk about good and evil. What I say at the beginning and the end is that it's the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity which take responsibility away from us, which take good and evil away from us. Because think about it. If you're in the politics of inevitability, then the good is just the thing you have now, and you're just going to have more of it, so that's fine. If you're in the politics of eternity, the other side is always evil. They're always attacking you. You're always innocent. Therefore, you're always good, and you don't have to think about what's actually good and evil. It's only when you start thinking historically, and you realize, aha, I actually have responsibility. I can actually move this world one way or another, that you have to decide what you're going to do, right? And you can't do that you can't make that decision about what you should do without having some account of what's good and what's not good. So the book is actually framed not just in terms of contemporary history and countries, which I've talked about here, it's also framed in terms of virtues. And now I mean that word entirely unironically. I run through Russia, Europe, Ukraine, and the US, and I run through the period 2010 to the present, but I also go through the virtues that I think our political institutions instantiate. The virtues of individualism as opposed to totalitarianism, the virtues of succession as opposed to state crisis, the virtues of state integration with neighbors, the virtues of new things, the virtue of truth, and finally the virtue of equality. Because I'm deeply convinced that we're not going to get out of where we are unless we understand where we are, but we're also not going to get out of where we are without some account of how things might look if they were better. And that's the note that I close on. It's not a note of things must be better or things must be worse. It's a note of civic responsibility. Thanks. Thank you very much. I think the format is that you now have a chance to ask questions. If you wouldn't mind just telling me who you are before you ask the question, that'd be nice.
My name is Lou Schwartz. That's who I am. My question concerns the growth of this totalitarianism, this authoritarianism in Hungary and Poland. This seems to be by consent of the populace rather than through intimidation and coercion. It seems like the people there are agreeing to having their freedoms limited. Can you comment on that?
So Hungary, we're talking about Hungary and Poland? Okay, so I'm going to make a couple of introductory remarks about this because I think there's some really important things in the background in both Hungary and Poland. The most important thing, which goes unsaid in their conversations in their countries, and which we often also leave unsaid here, is the European Union. Hungary and Poland are where they are as prosperous modern states, largely thanks to the European Union. Just like their West European neighbors, Hungary and Poland do not have a fantastic history of success as nation states. They did exist as nation states in the 1920s and 1930s. In both cases, it ended catastrophically, with Hungary as an Axis power and with Poland invaded from both the east and the west. Perhaps ironically, the way that European states actually secure their sovereignty is by joining the European Union. So there's this entire phantom dance about how the Europeans are taking our freedom away and they're making us measure cheese in a certain way and bananas have to be a certain shape and all this like utter, English tabloid nonsense. The fundamental truth is that the only way that European states have proven they can be durably sovereign without empire is inside the European Union. And this is important because, because of the major political truth that what we're really good at is taking things for granted. Like that's our truly human gift. I think the one that goes beyond all others is our fantastic ability to take things for granted. So the beginning of this conversation is that Poles and Hungarians take the European Union for granted, a little bit like you might take your parents for granted at a certain stage in life. And so they feel free to push back against the European Union, to treat it as the enemy, to treat it as the oppressor, and then to tell the electorate that the bad things are coming from the outside, and we're actually going to protect you from the European Union taking our sovereignty away, taking our way of life away. And this is possible, again, to make another European point, because the European Union, although it's very important in lots of ways, it has zero symbolic capital. The nations have all the symbolic capital, and Europe has zero. And this is it's a little bit like the United States, only more so, right? Like Montana is very charming, Wyoming's beautiful, but from Montana and Wyoming, Washington D.C. looks like nothing. It has almost zero symbolic capital. The federal government is not that charming. The European Union has the same problem, only more so. Brussels is just not charming to anyone. It doesn't seem to have any charisma. It doesn't seem to represent anything meaningful. So that's actually, I dwell on this because it's central to how this politics can work. These countries think they're not going to be kicked out of the European Union, that therefore everything is permitted. So Orban in Hungary literally governs by being a kind of chief among oligarchs who can take European Union subsidies and decide which way they're going to go, right? So his whole style is impossible without the European Union, which of course seems powerless to do anything about this. Similarly in Poland, you flout European Union decisions, but you never really believe you're going to get kicked out, right? You never believe that. So there's this weird sort of safety net around the whole thing, which makes it all inauthentic. Okay, now let me separate Hungary and Poland. In Hungary, what one has, which is worth worrying about, is an electoral one-party state, where a party actually does win elections to such a point where it has a constitutional majority, and then draws up the Constitution in such a way that it can never leave. That's not the same thing as the people not wanting to be free, right? That model of the fish, slowly being boiled, whatever, the frog slowly being boiled, is a model that we have to watch out for because it happens in America too, right? Think about North Carolina or Pennsylvania or states which although there are plenty of people who oppose the existing government, nevertheless have been moved in terms of their legislation towards basically a one-party situation. That's the Hungarian pattern. It's very hard to resist that kind of, because every step you can say, well, it wasn't illegal, right? There's smart constitutional lawyers who make arguments, but the Hungarian leadership are basically all lawyers, and then what they try to do is, in a lawyerly way, destroy democracy destroy the rule of law by way of law. Poland's a bit different. Poland was a bit accidental. The government that's in power is authentically popular. It won office not with a majority of the vote, but with about a third of the vote, and it won in the kind of odd constellation where, and I write about this in the book, where the other major party had just been hit by a tape scandal, which was almost certainly organized by the Russian Federation, and which is part of the Ukraine story, because it was revenge for particular Polish leaders helping Ukraine during the Maidan. So in Poland, I didn't talk about it at all, but things happened in Poland in 2015, like weird cyber scandals and dumps of emails, which are very similar to things that happened in the US in 2016. We didn't pay attention, of course, but many things rolled out in Poland much the way they rolled out here. But the thing which is specifically interesting in Poland is political fiction. Poland shows how authoritarianism grows from political fiction, which is an old story, but the most important political cleavage in Poland now, the single most important is, do you believe that in 2010 a Polish military jet with the Polish leadership was shot down by Russia or not? If you do believe that, you're on one side. If you don't believe it, you're on the other side. It's a bit like, was Obama born in Africa here, but more so. And the reason more so is that, it's not that they're like more credulous than we are, it's that there was an actual issue. If the actual president of your country and his wife and dozens of other important people die in a plane crash, that creates real emotional and spiritual, for lack of a better word, capital, which can then be exploited, right? Something actually happened, which was then turned in a certain direction. And precisely because it's fictional, it's very hard for people to get away from it, and it's very easy to manipulate. And so Poland, in this way, tells a slightly different story, because Poland is basically doing fine economically for the time being, which means that you can divide the population by saying those people who don't believe in our martyrdom, they're not the real Poles, right? And then you have the argument along cultural lines. But again, in Poland, it would be a vast overstatement to say people don't want to be free, right? You wouldn't find opinion poll data which says we want to give up freedom of the press. What you do find is that the freedom of the press becomes ever harder as the government is using state media to support its own agenda and so forth. So, I mean, in general, there's a European story here, and then there are particular stories which are a bit different one from the other, but both of which are useful in helping to understand how things can go here. Okay, am I supposed to choose?
We have a question.
All right, there.
Hi. My question is, I was reading about the FBI raid on Trump's lawyer, and it was just obviously one of many criminal things that have happened in the White House since Trump took office. And my question is, do you think it'd be fair to say that that there's enough evidence that we have now to say that America is basically the same, kleptocratic government that Russia is? I know that you've said in the in prior lectures that there's a lot of similarities between the two. But it just seems that every day it seems to be getting worse and worse, and we probably don't even know the half of it at this point. But do you think that we've pretty much become the same type of kleptocratic government that Putin runs in Russia?
No, I wouldn't say that we've become the same. But one of the reasons I wrote this book was that I was trying to reposition Russia in our minds. So there are some people who still say, Russia doesn't matter. I clearly think Russia matters. And then there are people who say Russia matters, but as this kind of hostile external force. I'm saying something different than that. I'm saying Russia represents a possible future for the United States of America. Russia is very useful to us because Russia shows how you can govern in conditions of severe wealth inequality with very limited social advancement, without the rule of law, but govern, how you can do it. It's not a pretty picture, but it can be done. And the things which Mr. Putin does are things which Mr. Trump tries, with much less success, it should be said, right? So Russia's in the book partly because I want us to see possible futures besides just the politics of inevitability, right? Besides just we're America, we're exceptional, everything's going to go great because we're America, right? And Russia's also in the book because I'm trying to show, secondly, as I talked about a little bit, how these practices can spread. So when Russians look at America, they see it the way you describe it because they see the things which are most like their own experience, and then they conclude the rest of it's a joke, right? So they think, well, if I can set up a shell company and an anonymous company and buy real estate, anonymously, that means American capitalism is a joke. And they're only partly right? But the fact that they're partly right is enough to convince them that the rest of it is a joke. And that's important because the whole thrust of their propaganda towards us is, it's all a joke, right? The rule of law is a joke, everything's rigged, everything that happens in politics can be explained by conspiracies. That's what they're trying to get us to think. And the closer we move to their reality, the less far-fetched their stories are, right? So I wouldn't say that we're there, but I would say that they represent a possible future, and the essence of their foreign policy is to try to seduce us into that future, right? The enemy is at home, your emotions are what matter, forget about policy. That's the siren song of Russian propaganda. That's the underlying message. Mr. Trump fits very well with all of this because Mr. Trump is an aspiring oligarch, right? Not all American politicians are like Mr. Trump. I mean, whatever we might want to say about the American political class, I think we can agree that they're not all like Mr. Trump. He's exceptional in this particular respect, or he's pretty far off on one end of the distribution. And Mr. Trump is also very useful in this respect because Mr. Trump doesn't believe in truth, right? Mr. Trump is he's a natural-born storyteller, which, by the way, is a skill set, right? I mean, it's easy for us to look at him and just criticize him and say he lies all the time. From his point of view, he's not lying. From his point of view, it's all a story. He is a fictional character living inside a fiction, and he's not lying, right? He's just spreading unreality, which is something different. He's not lying because in his world there's no truth. That's just for stupid people, right? In Mr. Trump's world. So there are overlays and influences, and as I see it, it's all one story where Russia got to a certain point faster than we did, and then it's kind of pulling us along.
My name is Stanley Gruber. Would you characterize the extent to which the politics of inevitability are a threat to Germany today, and whether you think Angela Merkel up to the job, up to the task?
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you for using the term politics of inevitability, because these are my words, right? Which I'm trying to, which frame they ended On Tyranny, by the way, as some of you might have noticed. Like, these are the last things I talk about On Tyranny and the first things I talk about in Road to Unfreedom. This is my way of trying to draw us out of the confusion, draw us out of the shakenness and the weirdness of the present moment, and to try to say where we are has a kind of logic. We're shifting from one timescape to another timescape, and that's why it feels like we're on a ship, where we can never get our sea legs, because we're moving from one idea of time to another. And until we recognize that we always live in ideas of time and that they can change, it's hard to figure out what's happening. Anyway, I think this is really important, but so I appreciate your using that term. Do I think it's dangerous? Yeah, of course it's dangerous. I mean, the politics of inevitability was the major American reaction, or one of the major American reactions to the election of Donald Trump. We said, various forms of American exceptionalism. The institutions are going to save us. A lot of people thought the stock market was going to crash on the first day, and that would immediately save us. We had these various versions of how we would automatically self-correct, which I personally don't think. I think self-correction is something you do yourself, right? That's why it's called self-correction. People say self-correction like it's somebody else's job. No, then it would be called somebody else correction. It's called self-correction for a reason, right? So yes, I think in the story it's a problem, and I think it's still a problem. In the story it's a problem because the thing that unites, Bush, Clinton, Obama is the increase in wealth inequality, right? That's the overarching story. Not that they're all equally to blame, but that's the overarching story from the 80s through the 2010s. And we had various ways we talked about that inequality, but nobody was facing up to it as something that could break the American system, which it is. So yes, I think the politics of inevitability is very much a problem. I think the Europeans are probably a year ahead of us in general in recognizing what's going on, right? So in late 2016, when the U.S. finally got a team together to send over to Europe and say, look at what the Russians did to our elections, the Europeans were basically like, yeah, we've been trying to explain this to you for some time, right? Because the thing that happened to us in 2016, which, whenever anything happens to us, right, it's the first time it's ever happened to anybody, right? It's true. No, like whenever an American gets divorced, it's like, this is the first time anyone's ever gotten divorced, When we die, it's like the first time anyone's ever died. Who knew this was going to happen to us, Americans? You're trying to decide whether that's funny or not, aren't you? So with when Trump happens, the reactions are something like either it isn't really happening, right? Like somehow it's going to get fixed, or nothing like this has ever happened. And when we find out about the cyber war, then we say either it's not real, right? A lot of people are still in that place, like it's not real. The Russians didn't really do it, or if they did it, it didn't really matter, or nothing like this has ever happened. Except to Estonia in 2007, except to Georgia in 2008, except to Ukraine in 2014, except to France in 2015, except to Poland in 2015, and accepted Germany in 2016. Except for those examples of Russian cyber war, it hasn't happened to anybody else, right? But that story never became our story because we were in this view of how we were special. So Merkel, is Merkel up to the task? Merkel has the advantage over a lot of other politicians that she grew up in East Germany and has a certain amount of healthy skepticism about political fictions. Mrs. Merkel has the advantage that Hillary Clinton would have had, I think, when dealing with misogynists, which is that you treat them with a certain amount of basic skepticism. So, I mean, one of the things which is happening in this book, one of the themes which I couldn't really go into is the theme of fragile masculinity. You know, the odd connections that hold Mr. Putin together personally with other male leaders like Berlusconi and Gerhard Schroeder, and for that matter, Trump. So masculinity challenged individuals in kind of a last-ditch clique, you know, to rescue some version of masculinity. Merkel has the advantage that she can't be drawn into that, right? At the very least. And you know, in many ways, she's also a very skilled leader. She's right in the crosshairs, as I know, which I mean, as I assume you know, which is why you asked the question. Merkel, of all the leaders in the West, is the one who's in the crosshairs of Russian propaganda. You know this, or if you don't, it's something I write about at length in the book. But the very same Russian bots who went after Secretary Clinton go after Angela Merkel, right? Literally the same bots. And by the way, it's very often with the same kinds of messages, like you can't trust this woman is a criminal, you know, this woman will give away your sovereignty, things like this. So she's not going to be, she's admirable. She's not going to be able to do it herself, right? I mean, the politics of eternity gives you leaders who are going to save the nation from eternal threats. The politics of responsibility, or which is what I call it, like the good thing, isn't going to ever depend upon just leaders, right? It's going to have to depend upon a whole bunch of other things. Russia's always going to be more dramatic, you know, in the role that it's in than the people who are working against Russia are going to be, because the people who are going to win against Russia are going to be loyal to institutions, they're going to cooperate one with the other, they're not going to make a big deal about everything, they're going to follow the rules and so on and so forth, right? So it'll never be like, just like it's not Mueller against Trump, like we want it to be Mueller against Trump. It's, you know, because it's two tall guys, right? You know, one of them's slim, one of them's not, you know, they both wear ties. It's very appealing, but it's not Mueller against Trump. It's rule of law against flouting the law. That's what it's really about, right? And with Merkel and Putin, it's basically the same thing. It's, can you have boring integration and let people have normal lives, or do you have to have spectacle and psychological war all the time? It's not so much the personalities, and so it's never going to be like a boxing match where like it's two figures, one against the other. Okay, that was a very long non-answer to your question, but I hope you found it interesting. I'm handing over agency to the microphone. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. My name is Marion. I'm very concerned about inequality in this society, so among the things that I am doing out of personal responsibility is that I'm a member of an organization called JFRED, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and I wanted to ask you, in terms of the politics of eternity, one of the striking things to me about the American domestic scene is the role that right-wing white evangelical Christians played in bringing Trump to power, and the role that people like Sarah Huckabee Sanders continues to play on the level of ideology, the fact that there is now blatant attempts to dissolve the constitutional separation between religion and state, with Betsy DeVos, with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, with a completely unconstitutional Bible study group in the White House. I'm wondering if you would comment on all of that.
Okay. So I honestly think a certain amount of Bible study would come in handy. I mean, there are some really interesting passages about, you know, the greatest law after loving God is loving thy neighbor strikes me as an interesting passage, which is specifically about loving the other, specifically about that, both in Leviticus and in the Gospels. There are some interesting passages about giving away your wealth in order to join me, about how it's harder, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to reach the kingdom of heaven. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the Bible if you actually study it. The thing I object to least in your catalog would be people reading the Bible in the White House. It's also the thing which strikes me as the most unreal. So on the institutions, I completely agree with you, and this is a way where you and I are being together, as it were, conservative, right? I mean, the legal order of the United States is built upon the premise that the state's not going to found a religion. That's how the whole system works. And interestingly, that is precisely why the system has been so favorable for the kinds of groups you're talking about. If there weren't separation of church and state, evangelical Christianity would not be so widespread, right? Because they would, if there were actually a contest for the state among religions, they probably wouldn't do so well as they're doing right now. In any event, it wouldn't be a pretty picture. And of course, I mean, I'm also scandalized by the notion that one is going to define the country religiously, or that somehow the Constitution doesn't say what it says it says. Where I would like to connect with you would be on the idea that this has something to do with the politics of eternity. Because of course, there's Christianity and there's Christianity. And as with Judaism, there are plenty of Christians who are happy to say, like, that's not actually Christianity, right? On both sides of the evangelical, non-evangelical dispute. I've heard it said by people on both sides. But the way that some of these views go together with the politics of eternity is this. You don't treat Christianity as a set of precepts at all, right? You don't think about Christianity, you think instead about Christendom. And you say, Christendom is eternally threatened by the Jewish conspiracy and by the Muslim masses and so forth. That's how it becomes a story of eternity. So therefore, you are not responsible for your individual behavior as a Christian, because the idea of good and evil comes entirely from the story of how the outsider is going to somehow disembowel your innocent community. And by the way, this is exactly what this Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyin says. And it's not surprising that there's a certain amount of common ground that's been found between some American Protestant evangelicals and the Kremlin. They've actually worked together on a number of issues, including sexuality. So anyway, it works as a politics of eternity precisely because you say, we're in a constant crisis. How can we think about doing the right thing as individuals? Because we have to preserve the collectivity against this regular assault from the outside. And having a white male president who calls himself a Christian is seen as a form of defense against that, right?
We so appreciate the depth of these answers, but this is all we have time for this evening. We want to thank Tim for being here tonight. You can purchase the Road to Unfreedom in the shop, and we look forward to greeting you in the lobby. Thank you.